previous lesson, I introduced the basics of tastes and flavors in food and wine, as well as how they can work together, either congruently or in a complementary fashion. Today, we are going to take a tasty step further into the art and science of wine and food pairing. We will discuss how wine interacts with food, including main tastes, textures, and flavors. We will break down the mechanics of pairing and examine the individual elements. And lastly, I'll present some classic pairing examples that you can try at home. I'd like to welcome you back to your professional diploma in wine appreciation from all of us here at Shaw Academy. Today, in Lesson 6 in your professional diploma in wine appreciation, we'll be diving a little bit deeper into food and wine pairing. My name is Julia Blaine. I am your educator for this course and a qualified winemaker with nearly a decade's experience in the industry. Together, we are going to explore all the wonderful things in the world of wine. At the end of today's lesson, you'll be able to explain how wine interacts with food, and you'll be able to recognize and list the core elements that make up the mechanics of food and wine pairing. And lastly, you will understand and evaluate classic pairing examples and apply these skills for your own pairing experiments at home. Before we dive in, let's quickly recap on what we learned in the previous lesson. In Lesson 5, we introduced the basics of food and wine pairing, a science and an art that has been practiced and enjoyed for as long as wine and food has been around. We learned why food and wine are paired together and how it works by breaking down the basic elements of taste and the mechanics of complementary, congruent, and classic pairings. With this foundation, we are able to explore how and why tastes work together. For example, why sweet and sour match well, and why bitter and bitter doesn't. On that note, did you try the challenge? Let's recap. In Lesson 5, I asked you to conduct a taste experiment at home where you paired red wine with dark chocolate and decide for yourself if you agree with this pairing or not, and why. Dark chocolate and red wine both contain tannins, and we know that tannins are responsible for the drying out experience on the palate. Dark chocolate and tannic red wine clash with each other because of the high levels of tannins that are present in both. So the wine will, as a result, taste overly bitter or sour, and the sensation on the palate might be overwhelming and not too pleasant. However, if you love chocolate and if you love wine, don't despair. Not all chocolate and wine pairings clash. You just need to get the basic elements to match in the right way. For example, try dark chocolate with sweet, rich wine like port, and now you're pairing bitter with sweet, and this is a pairing that works really well together. So in the previous lesson, we spoke about congruent or complementary pairings. Can you remember the driving principles behind these types of pairings? Let's take a moment to quickly refresh our memory. In short, a contrasting pairing works because it creates balance between flavors that contrast each other. This pairing works based on the principles that the flavor and aroma profiles present in the food and the wine bring balance to each other because of their contrasting elements. Think about salty buttered popcorn with a glass of Chardonnay. A good everyday example of this combination is salt and pepper or sweet and sour. So in other words, those are contrasting flavors that balance each other out. Now, for congruent food and wine pairings, they work because the combined experience celebrates and amplifies shared or common flavor compounds. A good example of this is how beef works well with mushrooms as they share an earthy and umami profile. Congruent pairings work based on the principle that the flavor and aroma profile in the food as well as in the wine will amplify and enhance each other. This is why a spicy, smoky, full-bodied Syrah works well with grilled meats that are spicy and smoky. Lastly, we've got classic food and wine pairing combinations that developed over time, and different cultures have their own approaches or rules when it comes to creating these pairings. For example, food and wine pairings in France follow very specific guidelines and rules, whereas in America, ideas are quite open minded, and the general tone is that you need to drink wine that you like. All of the different pairing systems have merit based on different traditions, cultural perceptions, and independent business models. Some food and wine matchings are so well matched because they have become classics over time. Let's look at some examples. Firstly, we have caviar and champagne. The acidity of the bubbly will cut through the salty brine of the caviar. Another classic is Stilton blue cheese with port. This creamy, salty cheese is really complemented with the sweetness of the port. Lobster with wooded Chardonnay is another one, and here we are pairing butter with butter. Next is beef with a Cabernet Sauvignon. Rich, fatty meat mellows out the tannins of the red wine. And lastly, a classic Sauvignon Blanc with grilled seafood. The acidity in the wine elevates the food. Think of what a squeeze of lemon does to a lovely dish of seafood. It just elevates the entire experience. So if you were to try one of these aforementioned examples, you might agree that the pairings are great and that they work. And in this lesson, we are going to explore the why by understanding how food and wine interact with each other. Food and wine pairings can be congruent or complementary, like we learned in the last lesson. And along with these broad categories, there are several levels that food and wine interact with each other. And these levels are as follows. They're either a mismatch, refreshing, neutral, basic match, or synergistic. A mismatch is basically where the wine and the food just don't match with each other. This means that they don't gel at all, and the sensorial experience is either dull, flat, or downright unpleasant. A mismatch happens often in foods that are intense, either in terms of acidity, salt, bitterness, or spice. An example of mismatching pairings are sweet and creamy with high acid wines, like ice cream and custard paired with a zingy, cool climate Sauvignon Blanc with a high acidity. Sweet and acid clash and are a total mismatch. The sweetness in the food will actually amplify the acidity in the wine, resulting in an experience that is overly tart or sour, and it can actually accentuate bitter flavors that are present in the wine. Another example is Asian hot and sour food with a New World Cabernet Sauvignon that is very fruity and tannic and has a high alcohol. Remember, in the last lesson, we used the term to describe a high alcohol as hot. So we also learned that hot will amplify hot. And in this case, a pairing like this will amplify and throw off the balance of the experience. This combination will accentuate astringency and bitterness that's present in the wine. A refreshing interaction is where the wine takes on the supporting role so as not to really dominate the flavor performance. The objective of the pairing is not to create a synergistic or heightened sensorial experience, but rather to act as a refreshing accompaniment to the food. This level of pairing can be appropriate in two cases. Firstly, if the food does not have many flavor or structural elements to pair with, so your choices of a synergistic pairing are very limited. And secondly, if the food is very intensely flavored, it could be challenging to find a wine that works synergistically with really big, bold flavors. This is often true for highly aromatic or spicy foods like curries. These types of foods that are very intense on the flavor part pair best with a refreshing wine with a nice acidity, like a dry Riesling. A neutral pairing is one that doesn't create a gastronomical experience that is greater than the sum of its parts. The objective here is for the wine to simply just not clash with the food. The majority of wines that one can buy today in your supermarket are made to be all-rounders and match with a large variety of foods and flavors. One would seek out a neutral pairing in a more casual dining setting where there are many flavors at play. For example, a potluck dinner or a family feast in the festive season. In this pairing, you'd want your wine to match with many different types and elements of the food and flavors, and you're not seeking to amplify or highlight any particular element in the food or in the wine. In your basic match level, the wine will match with the characteristic tastes of the food, meaning your salt, sweet, acid, or bitter elements, as well as with the weight or intensity of the dish. In a basic match, the flavors match well, but not synergistically. A popular pairing that is a basic match is a German Riesling with a little bit of residual sugar with baked trout. What makes this pairing work is the fact that the wine is very food friendly due to the fact that it has a slightly sweet yet balanced profile. If you want to level up this pairing, then the addition of herbs or perhaps smoking the fish lightly or adding a sauce will do the trick. These additions will add to the complexity and give you much more flavors to pair with, maybe leading to a more synergistic match and not just a basic match. A synergistic match is the top level of matching flavors when pairing food with wine and the ultimate objective. This means that the flavors create an entirely new sensorial experience that is elevated, enhanced, and superior to the individual elements. The wine forms an additional ingredient to the dining experience and is not just an accompaniment or beverage. There are many elements that are assessed when evaluating food and wine, including your flavors, aromas, and intensity. This wide array of elements that need to be taken into consideration in both food and wine is what makes pairing so challenging but so rewarding. To make things a little easier, it's helpful to group these elements into 3 categories. We have your main taste elements, next are the textural elements, and lastly, your flavor elements. The point of grouping the elements into categories is just to make it a little bit easier to identify and evaluate the main elements that drive potential matching forces with food and wine. One can use these categories to evaluate food and wine as a hierarchy of tastes, starting with the main taste elements, moving into texture, and lastly, evaluating the flavor. Your main tastes are your basic tastes that are sensed on the tongue, which we covered in the previous lesson, namely your sweet, salt, bitter, and acid. These basic taste elements are what form the basis of a complementary or congruent tasting. So, matching salt with sweet, for example, or combining acid with acid. When talking about texture, see this word as synonymous with body, weight, structure, or mouthfeel of food and wine. Texture is an important element in pairing, as it is essentially the binding element that holds the pairing together. Textural elements are what create a sensory impact on the palate and is not tasted. For example, how a tannic wine that is astringent will dry out your mouth. Texture can be used in congruent or complementary pairings and is normally described as a progression from light to medium to rich. Below are some more descriptive words used to describe texture in food and wine. We can use words like full-bodied, velvety, astringent, bold, light-bodied, or viscous. Some descriptive words that we can use in food are fatty, oily, dry, grainy, tough, or smooth. Another element that falls into the textural category is temperature, which will definitely influence the perception of the dining experience. Imagine the impact of an ice-cold glass of white wine with a seafood dish on a hot summer's day. When matching food with wine, the norm is to match lighter foods with light-bodied wines. Contrasting pairings are a little trickier, but can also be effective as long as there is balance and one does not overpower the other. Our last category are the flavor elements. Flavors are perceived as taste sensations on our taste buds, as well as aroma sensations, which are perceived retronasally, like we discussed in the previous lesson. Flavors are there to add complexity to the foundation that is formed by the taste elements and the textural elements. The Shaw Academy flavor and aroma wheel that we designed for you is a useful tool here when working on food and wine pairings, so keep it close by. To summarize, the main taste elements form the foundation of the pairing. The textural elements are what hold the pairing together. And lastly, the flavor elements add complexity. There are so many flavors that can be identified in wine, and this is why your flavor and aroma wheel are a useful tool to help you. Some examples of flavor descriptors in food and wine are fruity, floral, herbal, nutty, earthy, and spicy. Flavors can be paired with each other, either in a congruent or complementary fashion. And to make this a little easier, our flavors can be broken down into three main categories, namely our prominent flavors, which are any flavors that stand out, the intensity or richness, and lastly, the heat or spice. So let's just do a little recap of what we have learned so far when evaluating wine according to the main elements. When we evaluate wine according to the above-mentioned categories and elements, we have our main taste elements, our textural elements, and our flavor elements. And when we evaluate food, we use the same categories, so main taste elements, textural elements, and flavor elements. Now, let's break down these categories into little subunits. In wine, under our main taste elements, we determine whether the wine is dry or sweet. We evaluate the acidity level, as well as the effervescence, so whether the wine is still or sparkling. Textural elements that are evaluated in wine are the astringency, the alcohol, the presence of oak, and the body. And under our flavor elements, we look for any characteristic or dominant flavors, the intensity or the impact of the wine, as well as the heat or spice. And when we are looking at food, the main taste elements are sweet, salt, bitter, acid, and umami. In the textural elements, we look at fat, body, cooking technique, and lastly, our flavor elements. We look for prominent, characteristic, or dominant flavors. We evaluate the intensity of the food, and then the heat or spice. So using these categories and evaluating food through this lens and evaluating wine through the same lens will really help you match up and create pairings on your own. So let's take a look at some classic pairing examples using these methods. Let's start with some bubbles. Now, the examples that I'm going to be describing in the rest of this lesson are based on sort of your general examples. So let's look at champagne in the main taste elements, structural elements, and flavor elements. For this example, I am using a brut champagne or a dry champagne as an example. So let's break it down. Your main taste elements are the wine is dry, it has a high acidity, and in terms of effervescence, it's sparkling. Our textural elements, the wine has no tannins, it has a low alcohol, there's no presence of oak, and the wine will be described as light-bodied. Now, when evaluating the flavor elements, we are going to look at any dominant or prominent characteristics, and typically in champagne, you'll have your yeast-derived flavors like brioche. On the fruit side, we've got citrus and apple, and in this wine, there's no spice or heat. So what will we pair this wine with? The high acidity in the champagne is what makes it a really great food wine, not only for an aperitif, but for the main course as well. Champagne pairs really well with salty and fatty foods, as the high acidity is refreshing and will cut through any fat. Salt will elevate the elements in the wine. Think lighter meals and seafood dishes. Did you know that a standard glass of champagne emits about 30 bubbles in a second? So next up, we are going to break down the elements of a classic light-bodied Pinot Grigio. Let's look at the main taste elements. The wine is dry, it has a medium to high acidity, and the wine is still not sparkling. In terms of the textural elements, this wine has got no tannins, it has a low alcohol, no oak, and is classified as light-bodied. In our characteristic or dominant flavor elements, we have a lot of citrus and tree fruit. The wine is of a light intensity with no characteristics of spice. So, due to the light body of this wine, it will match best with lighter style foods like seafood dishes or white proteins. When matching flavors with each other, the fruity profile of the wine can also match well with foods that contain fruit like lemons, oranges, peaches, or apricots. So in this case, you are trying to match characteristic flavors in the wine with characteristic flavors in the food. Did you know that light-bodied Pinot Grigio is one of the most popular white wines that are enjoyed in the United States, along with Chardonnay, Riesling, and Sauvignon Blanc? Next up, we have our lovely oaked, buttery Chardonnay, very classic example of Chardonnay styles that are made in the New World. So let's break down this buttery Chardonnay in terms of main taste elements, textural elements, and flavor elements. So the wine is dry, it has a medium acidity, and is still not sparkling. In terms of the texture, this wine has got slight wood tannins on the palate and has medium to high alcohol. There definitely is some presence of oak here, and the wine will be classified as medium-bodied. Dominant or characteristic flavors are apples and pineapples. The wine has got a medium intensity, and we've got some characteristics of vanilla from the oak. Oaked Chardonnays are full-bodied and creamy with a buttery mouthfeel. These are the elements we need to keep in mind when pairing with food. The creamy, buttery texture of the wine will work really well with creamy, soft cheeses. In terms of proteins, oaked Chardonnay will pair well with white meats like chicken and turkey, as well as with fish. As oaked Chardonnay is fuller-bodied, it can pair well with herb-based sauces, so it can handle a little bit more flavor than a light-bodied wine. Try some herbs like fresh parsley, thyme, and tarragon. And dishes that feature citrus like lemon zest will pair really well with the wine, seeing as they share dominant characteristic flavors. Did you know that Chardonnay and Pinot Noir prefer similar climates? And for this reason, you will often see these two planted in similar areas. Next up, let's take a look at Pinot Noir. For this breakdown, I'm referring to a classic example of a medium-bodied Pinot Noir. The wine is dry, has a medium to high acidity, and is still. The wine has got low tannins, medium alcohol, it's got some presence of oak, and is medium-bodied. And in terms of dominant or characteristic flavors, we've got the classic cherry and raspberry as expected from Pinot Noir. We have some earthy tones, a medium intensity, and has some presence of cloves from oak. Pinot Noir pairs well with a variety of foods because it does not have a big, bold tannin structure. It has a nice high acidity, and these are traits that open up many pairing options. Fruit-forward Pinot Noir that can be perceived as a little sweet pairs well with food that has a little spice. Think crispy duck pancakes, pulled pork, or seared sesame tuna. If the Pinot Noir is more on the earthy profile, You can pair it with more earthy foods. Think gamey meats, mushrooms, and beetroot. Did you know that Pinot Noir is the world's most popular light-bodied red wine? Next up, we are going to look at Cabernet Sauvignon. For this example, I'm referring to a classic full-bodied Cabernet Sauvignon. Let's take a closer look at the main taste elements. This wine is dry with a medium acidity and is still. The textural elements, this wine is Cabernet Sauvignon, so we know it's got really high tannins, medium to high alcohol, definitely some presence of oak, and this wine is full-bodied. In terms of dominant or characteristic flavor elements, we have the classic profile of black cherry and currants. The wine has got a high intensity, and there's some elements of baking spice. This rich and intense full-bodied wine will pair really well with rich full-bodied foods with a lot of flavor. Think red meats. A classic pairing is a nice grilled steak with a pepper sauce and a Cabernet Sauvignon. The pepper sauce pairs really well with the subtle pepper notes in the Cabernet Sauvignon, thereby amplifying fruity notes in the wine. Can you remember which chemical compound is responsible for the black pepper, green bell pepper, or green peppercorn characteristics that can often be found in wines like Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, and Sauvignon Blanc? That's right, it's methoxypyrazines. A fun fact about Cabernet Sauvignon is that it is the most planted grape variety in the whole world. The total plantation makes up about 720,000 acres. The last wine that we will be looking at today is port. So let's take a classic example of port and break it down. The main taste elements. Port wine is sweet, it has a high acidity, and the wine is still and fortified. In terms of the textural elements, we have got high tannins, high alcohol, the wine is oaked and is full-bodied. And our typical or dominant flavor elements will be those of plum and cherry, some dried fruits like raisins. The wine has got a very high intensity and can have spice notes of cinnamon. Port has got all the basic wine elements that are turned up to full volume in terms of sweetness, tannin, acidity, and alcohol. This opens up a huge variety of pairings, congruent or complementary, and pairings with loads of flavor. You can really play around here with sweet and sweet, salty and spicy, tannin and fat, or acid, for example. Port pairs really well with meat, anything barbecued, chocolate, and cheese. Within the port realm, there are many different styles which add to the diversity of pairing options. And a very classic pairing is a good vintage port with a high-quality Stilton blue cheese. When you pair these two together, the sweetness in the port is actually softened, and the funk and intensity of the cheese is subdued, allowing the more subtle fruit flavors in the wine to come to the fore. What makes port really unique is that it is made of a blend of grapes that are indigenous to Portugal, and this can include up to 52 different grape varieties. So now we have spoken about the elements of how and why food and wine work together. But let's take a look at how to actually taste food and wine together in order to create an enhanced sensorial experience. Firstly, take a little bite of the food. Taste it and note any dominant flavors as well as your main tastes and your textural elements. Next, take a sip of wine and apply the same lens of evaluation in terms of your main tastes, textures, and flavor elements. Now, sit back and let the magic happen. Notice how these elements work together, which characteristics in the food and wine are highlighted. Think about it. Is this working congruently or complementary? Do the flavors gel really well with each other, or do they clash? This is the fun of food and wine, as there are an infinite amount of pairings out there. And remember to have fun with it. For this week's challenge, I'd like you to really get those creative juices flowing and use all of the skills that you've developed so far in terms of tasting, your knowledge of grape varieties, and now your new knowledge of food and wine and how they work together. I'd like you to go and create your own food and wine pairing at home, following the guidelines and the tools that have been presented to you in this lesson. Have your food and your wine and try and break down the elements using the worksheet that we've put together for you here at Shaw Academy. And tell us why you would pair a certain wine with a dish and what makes that pairing work. So let's take a moment to take a look at the 5 main skills that you're developing in this course. Firstly, tasting, including wine tasting, palate development, and identification and evaluation of wine faults. Next, we are learning to navigate the wine bottle, careers and terminology in the wine industry, as well as the elements of wine service. In the viticulture and oenology department, we have learnt about primary alcoholic fermentation, secondary fermentation and maturation, as well as viticultural practices. We have learnt about the principal wine styles, principal grape cultivars or varieties, and food and wine pairing. Lastly, we are going to study the wines of the world, including Old World wines, New World wines, and innovation in the wine industry. This is just the tip of the iceberg. As in wine, one really never stops learning. As in anything, but especially in wine, I believe, one learns best by doing. So keep on tasting and documenting your journey. Remember, all your summary notes and slides are available in your toolkit and will be really worthwhile to keep as a resource at your fingertips beyond this course. But no sneak peeks. The lesson notes will only become available after you have attended your lessons or caught up with your classes. These will also help you prepare for your first assignment. While these assignments are not for marks, they will definitely help you prepare for the final module assignment. And just a little hint from me, some of these questions may look familiar if you've done these weekly assignments. I'd like to thank you for joining me for today's lesson, and I really hope you enjoyed it. I can't believe that we are nearly done with Module 3, and you are one step closer to receiving your professional diploma in wine appreciation. Well done, keep it up, and I'll see you soon for Lesson 7.